Yeah, so this week I'm with Lora Cecere. Very thank you for having you on the show, Laura. Great to have you here. Let's start by, can you tell the viewers a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got here?
Well, thanks for having me on the show. My name is Lora Cecere. I'm the founder of a company called Supply Chain Insights. We provide research on the evolution of supply chain technologies, processes, and help companies to understand how they can drive value from their supply chains. We do that through quantitative research, qualitative surveys, and we sit on a database from 1982 to present to look at key metrics in the supply chain. So we're triangulating. I like to say that consultants know the answers, even though the answers might be wrong, and we're trying to help companies to figure out the questions they should ask.
Oh, that's very interesting. And how have you? How did you get into this? Where did you start?
So I started my career as a chemical engineer. I'm an old gal. I'll turn 70 this year. So I've been in supply chain for 45 years. First as a chemical engineer running factories for the likes of Procter & Gamble and Kraft and Clorox and Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream, which is now a division of Nestle. Then I built software for 15 years, and then I went to Gartner Group, and Gartner's an analyst, and they didn't care about supply chains as much as I did, so I went to a company called AMR Research, which is another analyst group, and wouldn't you know it, Gartner bought AMR, so I started my own firm.
Oh, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic story. You've got so much experience. That's crazy. What kind of things have you seen change over the years? Obviously, you've been in this industry a long time. You've done lots of different varied things, but are there any kind of pivotal changes that you've seen that you think to yourself, well, actually, that was a moment where things changed?
The evolution of regional to multinational to global supply chains has been something I've been studying. When you think back to Y2K, and many of your listeners may not remember Y2K, but we woke up, in year 2000 wondering if our systems would work. And that was sort of the end of the regional supply chain. And then what happened was we had the evolution of e-commerce business models, massive strides in telecommunication and computer capabilities and memory. And we also had the ascension of China into the WTO, which started us on the march from multinational to global supply chains, which radically changed how we did business in the world of supply chain. More inventory was in transit. We built global organizations, and the whole process changed considerably. Then when we had the meltdown in 2008, and we went through that massive period where, we were in a kind of a financial depression, there was a major shift for companies as they started to think about risk management and started to think about, what they were doing in cash to cash. To a greater degree. And then, of course, the pandemic was a time of experimentation and a lot of learning as well. Up until that point in time, we always assumed that logistics would be available. It would just be a matter of price. But during COVID, we actually found that logistics weren't always available. So the global supply chain was built on three assumptions: that governments would be rational, demand and supply variability would be low, and logistics would always be available. And we don't have truth in any of these three statements anymore. Governments are less rational. Demand and supply variability is much higher, and logistics is not something we can assume.
I think looking at traditional supply chain models, what do you think some of the biggest pain points customers are facing today? Obviously, you've mentioned there that the three pillars aren't necessarily something that can be assumed anymore. So where do you think the pain points are that companies face, from SMEs all the way to multinational organizations?
I think the biggest pain point is talent. And one of the overarching issues is, what is value? Most companies reduce cost. But if you reduce cost in a functional sense, so reduce manufacturing costs or reduce transportation costs, that doesn't necessarily translate to lower total cost or translate to lower operating margin, because the supply chain is a complex nonlinear system and we've got to manage it as a system. So many times we are focused on reducing costs in a function, but actually throwing the supply chain out of balance and creating more destruction. So, one of the things that I've been working on is what is value? And it turns out that if we focus on a balanced scorecard of operating margin, inventory turns, return on capital employed, and annual growth, that we can model the contribution of the supply chain at market cap per employee. And the linkage on a regression model is about 60%. But if we focus on narrow objectives and metrics like functional cost, then we will actually do harm. And I find most people measure way too many things. I work with companies that measure 50 to 100 metrics, and I'm like, that's absolutely crazy. You're throwing the supply chain out of balance, and there's no logic, and there's collinearity in those metrics. And they don't know how to work together. So I think the biggest issue in the supply chain is talent and clarity of what is value.
And how do you think SMEs can access that talent? Because obviously, if you're a big organization, then, I'm not going to say it's easier to access talent, but you've got more resources to throw at talent and consultants, etc., etc. How do you think SMEs, especially with everything that's going on in the world at the moment, can look at supply chain and access the talent to help them make the right decisions and get the right outcomes?
I think they've got to grow their talent. I think they need to take bright, capable individuals and teach them the basics of supply chain, things like complex system theory, help them to understand supply chain finance, help them to understand what is good supply chain planning, what is a good plan. I think they have to grow their talent.
I understand. Do you think there's any room in the world right now for, I don't want to use the word consultants in relation to this, but there's a lot of, we're in the software game. Obviously, we do SaaS software where people can, sign up to our solution and use it. And we have a huge mix of customers from really small SMEs to big international companies. And what I'm seeing right now is a lot of the big international companies really look at their supply chain and how they can change things. And one of the trends I'm seeing right now is people pulling out of China and looking at manufacturing in other regions for basically speed and reduce logistics costs. Do you think there's space, or do you think there is services whereby SMEs can access consultation as a service, I suppose, is what I'm asking. And do you see any trends in that market or any kinds of evolution of that market?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it depends upon the industry. If we can reshore and move assets, certain industries like semiconductors, we can't do that. Apparel, the manufacture of gray goods is pretty locked down into Asia. It's not like you can flip a switch and build a textile factory. But, network design, the ability to look at alternate routes, alternate supply base, those capabilities are widely available for SMEs through small boutique consulting firms. And I advocate that people should design their supply chain a couple of times a year. We basically should align to what is value, and the design is source, make, and deliver. Unfortunately, too few companies design their supply chains, right? So I was a chemical engineer. I couldn't get out of chemical engineering school without designing distillation columns and heat exchangers, and I've never had to do that in the practical professional world. But only 3% of companies actively design their supply chains, and that's a travesty.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think people aren't more focused on it and looking at it more?
I think it's naivety. I think that people accept the supply chain, and I think particularly in Europe, where people tend to view the supply chain more transactionally. Mm-hmm. They tend to look at order to cash and procure to pay, and those processes and running them efficiently as supply chain excellence, versus saying, how do I design the supply chain? How do I adapt the supply chain? How do I make sure I have the right push-pull decoupling points, the right buffers. And I think it gets down to, active design of the supply chain. I think everyone should have a supply chain designer that's closely coupled to a strategic thinker in the supply chain to think about what should be the supply chain definition.
And speaking about supply chain, obviously we've mentioned it a lot because your work revolves heavily around supply chain. But for those who are listening who don't really know what that means, and for people who are, especially SMEs, like, what does it mean to you? What is supply chain in the most simplest way possible?
I think that is really a good question. And I think every organization should ask themselves, what is the supply chain and what is supply chain excellence? For me, it is the design of the systems and the processes to enable the manufacturing of goods and services in the most effective way to a strategy, which means the design of sourcing, manufacturing, distribution to align goods and services with the market. And I basically am focused on how do we align that market to market from the channel to the supplier to look at information flows, cash flows, and product flows. And most people only will look at product flows and they may look at cash flows, but they don't necessarily look at information flows, things like demand latency or perpetual inventory latency or demand sensing or supply sensing. There's a lot of latency and black holes in our current supply chain systems.
Absolutely. And do you think the pandemic highlighted some of that for people? Like, from my point of view, the amount of people who suddenly found supply chain as a big problem with the pandemic, not being able to get things or not being able to get things as fast as they used to. I saw lots of people running out of stock of things. And do you think the pandemic was a kind of a wake-up call for people, or do you think actually it's past now and that's it? People don't care anymore.
I think the wake-up call was, when the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. And suddenly everybody became a supply chain expert. I mean, I've never seen so many supply chain experts as when the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. It's like, and then when the Houthis started, doing bad things in the canal, a lot of people became supply chain experts. But, not really deep in supply chain. And I think we've lost a lot of the lessons of COVID.
I think one of the things that we saw when COVID was happening was a huge uptake in e-commerce and a huge uptake on people moving to platforms like Amazon, eBay, trying out other platforms, other marketplaces in that thing. And obviously with all the bricks and mortar stores closed, I've never seen so much compost and toilet paper leave a warehouse as I did throughout COVID. It was absolutely insane. But one of the things that I think it really highlighted for me and the customers that we have was prices of everything went up in relation to, if you want it fast, it's going to cost you more. And there was people paying, £20 for a bottle of hand sanitizer. And I think one of the things that happened was a lot of people over-ordered stuff. So, now hand sanitizers everywhere and it's irrelevantly cheap. But I suppose the question here is, one of the things that we saw when the pandemic was happening was people kind of doing whatever they could to get hold of goods as fast as possible to sell online. And I think when the pandemic ended, the amount of oversupply of goods was quite large for some of our customers. And I think that one of the things is obviously the demand dropped. Have you seen in what you're doing them kind of people failing to analyze the data to make the right buying decisions and therefore kind of just going on gut instinct? And is that something you see a lot? And if you do, is it more in small businesses or is it larger businesses as well? But do people actually look at the data? It's one thing to have data, but do they actually look at it and analyze it and make buying decisions based on it? Hopefully the question makes sense.
Depends upon who people are in your statement, right? There are lots of people up and down the supply chain. So
I can try and define it. When I'm talking about people based on the kind of customers that we deal with, I would mainly be talking about business owners, if they're SMEs, or people who buy at businesses, buyers at businesses potentially, who are looking to acquire products to sell in our expertise on online marketplaces. And I suppose people for me would be the kind of people that we work with, which would be SME business owners or buying teams at slightly larger businesses.
Yeah.
So, Matthew, what you're talking about is baseline demand and demand elasticity and demand and supply balancing, right? And so, if we think about aggregate buying and we think about sensing customer sentiment, um, we're not very good at the translation of market to market data. And there's a great opportunity for us. And I think that small, medium businesses can do that much more readily than large companies because there's less politics and there's more focus on what are people really buying. And if you look at the translation of demand in the supply chain, and if you focus on order translation, you'll typically be 4 to 6 weeks off the market. And if you try to translate that into an aggregate buying schema, you'll always be too late. So, sensing shifts in actual channels with almost no latency and making buying decisions based upon pricing with almost no latency is a core competency that I think all small businesses should try to achieve.
One of the things that's interesting in our target market, like I said, which primarily would be SMEs, is we're seeing a massive uptake in the kind of people using BI and reporting tools that maybe a few years ago they wouldn't be using. So one of the core questions we're getting asked now is, can I have access to the data? Can I feed it into some analytical platform? And one of the things that we're seeing, which brings me on to my next point, is people trying to analyze that data using AI. So lots of people trying to get it in. And to be very specific, because obviously AI is a buzzword, we're seeing a lot of people want to put their data in something like GPT and analyze it using that or similar tools. And what's your take on the evolution of AI for this kind of space?
So I think that artificial intelligence has a real place in driving a step change in how we do work. But unfortunately, I think what we're doing today is we're using promising tools in stupid ways. So if I think about generative AI and I think about the relationship of the data to baseline demand and demand elasticity, I have to know what that is to teach the engines. And so most people don't know those relationships to begin with. So you have to start with some predefined hypothesis, like if this happens, then people will buy more, or this product is more subject to pantry loading, or this particular product can be cannibalized by. So you have to start with basic hypothesis and really help the models. We can't just dump data into a model and expect that that model is going to be able to ferret out usable information. Now, if we think about the whole cadre of AI techniques that are evolving, I have built generative AI models based upon what I'm releasing on the fundamental score. And I'm a big fan of generative models for unstructured data, which traditional supply chains don't deal with unstructured data very well. Things like customer sentiment as an example of unstructured data, or email data, or as an example. So one of the things I built for my generative AI model is I took all my YouTube, podcasts, blogs, ebooks, and put them together in a generative AI model called Ask Lora, and put together the fundamental score on top of it, which has all of the financial metric data from 1982 to 2023, which allows people to ask, what do I do to improve market capitalization? What are the supply chain metrics that are most important for market capitalization? And it allows them to move within guardrails. The models need guardrails. I also believe that narrow AI and the use of optimization is a great technique. Machine learning to clean data. One of the things that we've got to break is that most of our supply chain technologies were built on relational databases that really depended upon data to be very pristine. We locked all the data into data jails. And so as we go to machine learning and we go to near AI, we have the opportunity to move to schema on read versus schema on write technologies, and to be able to use branch logics for multiple ifs to multiple thens, and ontological frameworks for rationalization and decision making. And that changes our ability to drive optimization. It basically allows us to have much more expansive models. So if you think about the traditional supply chain optimization, it was a single if, so shipments or orders, into a model for a single outcome of time phase data and forecasting based upon data locked in a data jail. This whole world of narrow AI, rules based ontological frameworks offers us a lot of opportunity to be able to drive insights into data. And now we have agents that can be trained, and my goal is that that could become self-service supply chain planning. Most companies have hundreds and thousands of supply chain planners that are very locked into jobs that are not very productive. I mean, most people spend time in meetings, and there's a lot of arguments around things like forecasting or inventory strategies. And so, if we think about agents and we think about self service AI and the ability for teams to collaborate on the data based upon better insights, we have the opportunity to redefine work. And that's what I think this whole evolution boils down to. Sort of like when I was in the 1980s and we had typing pools and people didn't have computers on their desk. And, we had to get rid of the typing pools. We have to do the same thing with planners. The planning role has to be redefined into an orchestrator role to be able to look at how do we clean data, develop hypothesis, do natural language programming for ontological frameworks, and serve up the data to business leaders. And so we're in that transition, but we can't make the mistake of just putting limited AI into traditional supply chain technologies. We have to redefine work and redefine those taxonomies. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. It's really interesting because what you're talking about there is, there needs to be a huge shift in the way that business owners or shareholders think about supply chain and how that works. There's a large customer that we work with in the UK who also in the US, and I know they've gone through massive growth, huge growth. So in the past 5 years, they've gone from basically selling nothing to, absolute phenomenal growth, huge company. But they're at a point where they've kind of bootstrapped themselves with systems to get to a point where they're functioning, and now they're bringing in consultants from all over the world to kind of look at the supply chain and look at how they move to the next level. And what's really interesting, I was in a meeting with them a few weeks ago, and they had a set of consultants who were talking about bringing in planners and bringing in that entire department, and they had another set of consultants that were saying you just need to use AI to do it. And that's really interesting because it seems like there's a real two directions, like go the traditional route or embrace the technology. Hopefully I embrace the technology if they get it right. But I just think you're talking about a real industry shift. But SMEs who are growing rapidly might be the people who have never had them departments who can embrace this technology and kind of prove the point that it works, I suppose.
That's right. And actually, some of the leading supply chains in the world are small, medium businesses, right? They outperform the global multinationals because there's less politics and more clarity around what customers want.
100%. And do you think people will embrace it, or do you think? And when I say people, obviously, to define what I mean by that, like, do you think we're kind of 5 years away or less from it being the norm, or do you think it'll take a lot longer than that before it is the norm?
Depends upon what norm is. I think we're 2 years away from the redefinition of the taxonomies and declaring traditional technologies dead. Only 7% of companies are innovators in the supply chain, so then you'll start the adoption. Most people are very stuck in their spending patterns based upon things like RISE and ERP upgrades, and so kind of a CapEx cycle that we'll go through before people will really absorb it. And most people in the supply chain are kind of wait and see, kind of like they'll cross their hands and they'll wait for the innovators to do it, and they'll wait to see if the innovators succeed. But I think we're 5 to 7 years away from mass
And do
adoption.
you think the people who wait and see is because they're worried about their jobs, or do you think they're just not the kind of people to grab something and roll with it? The reason I ask is because I often have conversations with people where I say, people don't want to get fired by trying new things, and therefore it kind of puts the brakes on a little bit in some organizations. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there's some of that, but I also think that some cultures, just by definition, are more innovative than others, right?
Yep.
And I think it depends upon if the culture supports innovation.
100%. And the company that they're working at as well, I suppose. Where do you think sustainability fits into all of this? Does it have a role to play? I know in the UK there's lots of legislation around this now, but do you think it has a bigger role than complying with legislation?
I think corporate social responsibility has a huge role to play in the definition of supply chain excellence in the brands. I think that we go through waves where it's more important relatively than others, right? I think that right now, we're dancing in the world of tariffs and the redefinition of global flow. When that dies down, we'll be back to talking about circularity and sustainability. The difficult thing is that people don't know where things are sourced from, and they are not really good at the managing of networks. One of the things that we've done is we focused on enterprise applications, but not really the mapping of networks. And many people are very confused about the difference between mapping, sort of taking a picture of the supply chain, and lineage and provenance, which allows us to look at the bidirectional flow across trading partners on each individual shipment. We really need to be moving to network-based lineage, provenance, and being able to define our systems for rework and remanufacturing and demanufacturing for the improvement of circularity. And for most companies, that's a long ways away from implementation. What I find most companies doing is they're kind of putting icing on a bad cake. They have a global social responsibility statement that says they're doing really great things, but they don't really have a true handle on the supply chain in terms of where things sourced and, how could they do it better.
In the UK media, we see a lot that kind of sustainability is painted as the enemy of progress. And I just wondered, I don't know if that sentiment shared in the US or not, but I just wondered if you've got any thoughts on that.
I think that corporate social responsibility and true ownership of the supply chain is in harmony with good business practices. One of the biggest issues in corporate social responsibility is we're not good at demand planning. We make the wrong things, and we make the wrong things too expensively, and then we landfill them, right? And so as we think about getting demand right, sensing demand, translation of demand, aligning and designing these networks to minimize waste, that's just good business. And we don't do that very well. We're off planting trees and, doing craziness. I do think remanufacturing and demanufacturing is something that we need to get better at. I grew up, in the post-war generation where, everybody recycled everything. We don't recycle much of anything. And demanufacturing, remanufacturing, we really need to rethink our fourth moment of truth. The supply chain has 4 moments of truth: stimulation of desire, making sure that the goods are there when they need to be purchased, making sure that, people are delighted, and then taking responsibility for the waste stream of the supply chain. We need to be better at that fourth moment of truth.
One of the things that, I'm currently 36, and I used to be an electrical engineer before I got into software. And I used to be a big advocate of right to repair. And, I used to fix all my own stuff, right? From kettles to toasters to cookers to everything. And I think certainly with computers, like the computer that's sat in front of me right now and the mobile phone, like, I can't repair this if it breaks. If the screen cracks, I can probably replace the screen. But right to repair seems to be gone. And, talking about recycling and stuff, I remember when on every industrial estate in the UK, certainly where I am in Yorkshire, there was council recycling centres where you could go and buy used computers, you could go and buy a hard drive, you could go and buy RAM. It's all gone now. Everything just seemed to just be disposable, and it's all right. You can just buy a new one. So I agree with you on that point. I think one of the problems is the skills that seem to be there for people to repair and replace. You know, my daughter's 16. She wouldn't. To her, it's when the iPhone breaks, you get a new one, Dad, and that's it. And I think, do you think that's a challenge that we need to overcome as a society, or do you think it is just a natural evolution of things getting cheaper to manufacture and kind of just the evolution of where we're going as a society?
I think it's a challenge that we need to overcome. I'm fearful that we're entering a war-torn era. And, if we think about rare minerals, or we think about, the basic materials of aluminum, iron, etc., if we are really going to be in a war-torn area, we won't have global trade for those minerals, and we need to recycle. So I think getting good at recycling is a massive opportunity for most governments to be able to implement recycling programs. And I think for most large manufacturers to implement demanufacturing of where can people take a computer and, be certain that those parts go into a good reusable stream. Think about all of the rare minerals that were in those early handheld phones that were like bricks, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of opportunity. So I think that the media gets a lot wrong around sustainability. And, we are dabbling, planting trees everywhere versus really thinking about how can we be good corporate citizens? How can we make the right products the first time? How can we minimize waste in our processes? And how can we own that moment of truth?
And
when I go to some countries like India or China, and I see all of the plastic water bottles littering the planet, or I think about plastic in the ocean, we have not been good corporate citizens. Only 7 to 9% of plastic is ever recycled, depending upon the country, right? We should fix that.
Yeah.
We should stop talking about it, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's not that difficult to fix if you actually want to fix it, but it's just someone has to actually want to fix it. And the truth is that for a lot of people, if we talk about plastic bottles for a second, it's more expensive to buy water in a glass bottle. It's more expensive to buy Coke in a glass bottle. And I don't know why. I'm not sure if it needs to be or not, but Coke always used to be in glass bottles. It still is if you go to fancy restaurants. But yeah, I think there's an interesting point there. Do you think there needs to be more education in schools around supply chain and around responsibility and that kind of thing? Just like with Trump's tariffs in the US right now, there's a lot on the media with people not understanding what a tariff is necessarily, and therefore, do you think there should be more education so people are more aware of where their goods in their hands come from?
Well, I'm a supply chain gal, so I always think there needs to be more education. And that's one of the reasons why I do these free classes, 4 times a year, to try to help people think about new technologies and new ways of working. And, absolutely. But we're not doing a very good job of supply chain education. We're teaching, outdated concepts and not really helping governments to think about how do they play a role in building the infrastructure for sustainability. How do you recycle plastic effectively? Only 1% of apparel is ever recycled. How do you build systems that allow people to reuse fiber? We're not thinking about that. How do we encourage people to have demanufacturing plants, or like you're talking about the repair, right? Repair centers, etc. So I think we have a lot of thinking of, being wasteful consumers and building wasteful supply chains to being supply chains that really are fit for purpose to minimize waste.
I don't know if it's the case in the US or not, but in the UK, it seems like the entire buying cycle is tailored around don't repair, don't recycle. Because, for example, if I think about a washing machine, like if my washing something as basic as a washing machine, if I think about my washing machine now, if I went home and it was broken, buying a new washing machine would be as easy as going online, pressing a few buttons, and I could pay for it monthly if I wanted to. Don't even have to have the money to buy it. Getting my washing machine repaired, well, I have to have the money to pay for that repair, and I have to wait probably a few days for someone to come out, if not weeks. It's just not as easy to kind of keep what I've got and have it repaired as it is. It feels very accessible to replace and not very accessible to repair or recycle, and it feels like the whole system's rigged in that direction.
It is, right? So let's take the washing machine. The washing machine could tell you what's wrong.
Yeah.
You know, I think about trying to get a service guy in. Most service guys are not very. So let's say we wait and we pay that money. There's no assurance that the service guy is going to fix my washing machine, right?
No.
But the washing machine could tell you what's wrong, right? You know, it could give you an output that could say, this is what, you know, needs to happen. We don't build our systems for intelligence around that fourth moment of truth, which I think is an opportunity.
Yeah, huge opportunity, and also great for the planet and great for the ecosystem. And if trade barriers do go up and this all stays longer term and things get naturally more expensive, you know, repairing is a real alternative option for people who can't then afford to buy new. It does need to be more accessible.
Right.
One last question. If there was one thing that you think people should know about in regards to the remit of things you talk about, what would it be? If there's just one point you could get across in the next 2 minutes, what would that most important point be, do you think?
I think that, you know, supply chain management was defined in 1982 as source, make, and deliver working together. And we haven't gone very far in the evolution of our processes and our technologies. And a lot of people have gotten very rich off of technologies. But I think that we cannot miss the principles of designing our supply chain and operating our supply chains for value and minimizing waste. And we don't do that today. And that is our opportunity.
Sounds like an amazing business opportunity with everything that's happening in the world as well. If someone wants to jump on, thank you very much for your time and for talking to me, Lorna. Incredibly interesting. And thank you very much for being on the show.